Welcome to the debate.
Today, we're digging into a really tough subject, the systemic crisis unfolding within the Alabama Department of Corrections. It's reached a point where there's actually a federal mandate for reform.
That's right. And the urgency, I think, was starkly highlighted by the recent documentary, The Alabama Solution. It used footage, contraband, cell phone footage, mind you, gathered under incredibly dangerous conditions by incarcerated men like Robert Earl Council and Melvin Ray. And it exposed conditions that are, frankly, hard to fathom.
Exactly. We're not just talking about poor conditions. The material really confirms this is a constitutional failure, specifically violations of the Eighth Amendment, the ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The film shows, rampant officer abuse, truly squalid living conditions, violence that's just unchecked, and tragically high rates of death from overdoses and murder.
And institutional cover-ups, let's not forget that, including the highly suspicious death of Stephen Davis.
Right. So faced with all this, the state's official response, championed by Governor Ivey's administration, is this enormous $1.25 billion prison construction project. They're calling it the Alabama Solution. It includes massive new facilities, one even named the Governor K. Ivey Correctional Complex. So the real question for us today, the debate is, does this huge investment in buildings and infrastructure actually address the root causes, the deep-seated corruption, the policy failures, the human rights abuses, or is it just, tackling a symptom?
And that's where we differ. My position is that building new prisons, while maybe not the whole answer, is a necessary, tangible, and frankly, immediate first step. It's required to stop the current humanitarian disaster and just begin to move the ADOC out of this state of constitutional noncompliance. The physical reality, the overcrowding, that's the primary driver of the chaos and violence right now.
And I see it quite differently. I think building new prisons, calling that the Alabama Solution, is frankly an absurdity. It focuses entirely on the symptom, the capacity issue, while completely ignoring what I see as the malignant cancer, the policy choices, the systemic corruption, the lack of accountability. My argument is that this project is just a very expensive expansion of mass incarceration. It's designed, really, to secure the state's ability to warehouse people it has actively chosen not to release.
Okay, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Let's just look at the raw logistics for a second. These facilities right now are holding nearly 20,000 people in spaces designed for less than 12,000. That's operating at close to 200% capacity, and they're doing this with less than a third of the staff they actually need to maintain basic control. That is the definition of an immediate life safety crisis. The film showed us rat-infested cells, piles of human waste. This isn't hyperbole. This extreme density combined with buildings that are literally falling apart makes any kind of real management or security practically impossible. New, modern facilities are just essential to reduce that density and meet the bare minimum standards the Constitution requires. You simply can't start the deeper work of policy and cultural reform until you stop the bleeding, stop the immediate dying.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. I don't buy that the physical structure is the root of the problem. Focusing on infrastructure feels like a convenient way to avoid confronting the policy failures that created this overcrowding. You mentioned 200% capacity, but that density is in large part a manufactured crisis. The state, under this very administration, has actively made it worse.
How so, specifically?
Well, the documentary points directly to the appointment of a parole board chair whose, let's say, rigid approach resulted in parole grants plummeting to just 8% last year. 8%. That means denying release to 92% of people who are actually qualified.
Okay, that's a shocking number.
It is, and combine that with the state actively tightening the rules on earning good time credit, making it harder for people to shorten their sentences through good behavior, it shows a very clear political decision, a will to keep people locked up regardless of the conditions. So I have to ask, why spend $1.25 billion building new space when you're simultaneously making sure the old space stays crushingly, dangerously full? It seems contradictory.
That's a compelling argument. And look, I won't defend the parole board's decisions. They are frankly indefensible. and they absolutely make the density crisis worse, no question. However, and this is the key point for me, regardless of the policy failures that got us here, the state has an immediate legal obligation right now, a 14th and 8th Amendment obligation to provide a safe environment for the people currently in its custody. Waiting for complex, politically charged parole and sentencing reform, which could take years, just isn't a viable strategy when people are dying today in conditions the Department of Justice itself has called unfit for human life. The physical environment, the overcrowding, the dilapidation, that is the immediate point of constitutional failure. Reducing that density has to come first, or at least happen concurrently, before any systemic policy reform can realistically take hold. The state's investment, whatever the motivation, signals seriousness about fixing that baseline physical infrastructure.
But if we stay on policy for just a moment more, why is there such resistance to reducing the population through parole, through sentencing reform? It seems illogical, unless you consider the economics. Building these huge new prisons fits perfectly into a larger economic picture in Alabama. The state is heavily invested, you could say, in maintaining this large incarcerated population.
How so?
The state profits roughly $450 million every year from forced labor, from penal labor. We're talking about incarcerated individuals, mostly black men, being paid as little as $2 a day for their work. This isn't a small thing. This labor supports state operations, everything from maintenance at the governor's mansion to work at the state capitol. If your state budget relies on $450 million worth of essentially free labor, well, building bigger, more permanent prisons starts to look like perpetuating the system that provides that labor pool. It actively discourages reforms that would actually reduce the number of inmates.
That financial incentive, the legacy of penal labor, it's undeniable. And it's frankly abhorrent. It's something the legislature absolutely must confront. It's a holdover from a much darker part of history. But let me try to frame the construction aspect slightly differently. You hear figures like Attorney General Marshall framing this as, an Alabama problem deserves an Alabama solution. They're trying to manage this crisis locally, resisting federal oversight.
Which sounds good, but what does it mean in practice?
Provides a modern, more controllable environment. In theory, this makes it harder for corruption to thrive, allows for better surveillance, and lets the state demonstrate to the federal courts that it can meet constitutional standards on its own without a complete federal takeover. It's about regaining control, or at least the appearance of control.
But if the real priority was safety and control, wouldn't they focus on accountability, on the culture inside? The construction feels like a massive red herring when you look at where the state actually spends its money when it comes to personnel. The film pointed out Alabama spent $51 million, $51 million, in just the last 5 years defending officers against misconduct lawsuits. That money had to come from somewhere. That tells you where the real priorities lie.
That's a significant figure.
And it brings us back to the tragic case of Stephen Davis. Beaten to death by officers. There's eyewitness testimony directly contradicting the official story that he charged them with knives. And the officer reportedly involved in that beating, Roderick Gadsden, who apparently had a history of excessive force complaints, was he fired? Was he disciplined? No. He was promoted. Twice.
That is deeply disturbing.
It demonstrates a culture backed by financial commitment that protects brutality, that enables it. It's not about fostering a safe environment. So investing $1.25 billion in new walls seems utterly meaningless if the people inside those walls operate within a system that shields them from consequences for horrific actions.
I absolutely agree that the lack of officer accountability is arguably the most corrosive part of the whole ADOC system. And promoting an officer with that kind of record, it's a profound failure of leadership, plain and simple. I do have to push back, though, just slightly on the idea that infrastructure is entirely irrelevant to corruption. Part of the reason that corruption, that lucrative trade in drugs and cell phones we see in the film, thrives is precisely because of the existing infrastructure. These old, dilapidated facilities are nightmares from a security standpoint.
Okay.
Provides tools that could potentially reduce the opportunities for the very corruption you're rightly highlighting. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a tool.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. I see the problem less as leaky walls and more as a rotten core. The corruption feels cultural. internal. You have officers, it seems, operating like an organized criminal element, using their power to run rackets. A shiny new building doesn't fix a malignant culture of brutality and cover-ups. And we have history as a guide here. Look back at the last big prison construction push under Governor Fob James. It didn't stop this current crisis from developing, did it? Simply building a new structure doesn't immunize the state against future failure if the underlying policies and the culture of violence aren't fundamentally changed. We risk just building bigger, more expensive cages for the same broken system.
But how do you even begin to establish a baseline for cultural change? That requires better hiring, better retention, proper training, effective surveillance, all things that are incredibly difficult, if not impossible, when the physical environment itself is inherently hostile, dangerous, and uncontrollable. The immediate safety threat, the squalor shown in the film, requires moving people out of those conditions. Modern facilities with better security and monitoring are a necessary tool, maybe not sufficient, but necessary, to empower good staff, to increase oversight, and to reduce the opportunities for misconduct. While cultural change is the ultimate vital goal, fixing the immediate logistical nightmare feels like a non-negotiable prerequisite for meeting basic Eighth Amendment standards.
And I still maintain that if the state builds these billion-dollar cages without fundamentally fixing the policies that fill them, the parole system, the sentencing, the economic drivers of forced labor, then these brand new prisons will just be stuffed back to 200% capacity within a decade. It becomes a horribly expensive, self-perpetuating crisis, funded, let's not forget, partly with federal COVID relief money and funds diverted from education. It risks being a $1.25 billion monument to policy failure, not a solution.
So, to sum up my position, the state's approach, this construction initiative, while definitely tangled in politics and carrying serious policy disconnects, it can't be dismissed entirely. It directly addresses the critical logistical failure, that staggering 200% capacity, and the urgent need to improve physical safety and simply reduce density. New facilities, in my view, are a necessary component, a required ingredient for any successful reform effort aimed at alleviating the immediate acute human suffering we saw so graphically documented.
And I'll reassert my view. Calling this construction project the Alabama solution is not just inaccurate, it's a profoundly dangerous distraction. By refusing to tackle the fundamental issues head-on, reforming parole, ensuring real officer accountability, dismantling the economic reliance on forced labor, these new prisons risk becoming nothing more than $1.25 billion monuments to an expanded human rights crisis. The state is investing in a shiny facade while the cancer of corruption and policy failure continues to metastasize underneath.
Ultimately, the evidence presented, driven by the incredible courage of incarcerated individuals like Robert Earl Council and Melvin Ray, really forces all of us to grapple with these conflicting institutional priorities. The question for the listener remains, is the physical capacity failure the most urgent constitutional problem to fix, or must the focus be squarely on policy, accountability, and deep cultural transformation first and foremost?
Considering these different perspectives, and acknowledging that both arguments draw on powerful, credible evidence from the material itself, really underscores just how complex and deeply entrenched this crisis actually is. There are no easy answers here.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.